Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. Thank you for joining us as always. Along with me is Mike. I'm Reed. Mike, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good. I got the stack of comics over there,
You always got the stack representing for sure.
and
Um,
we we drove by Wednesday at the local comic book shop. They had the annual Thanksgiving potluck dinner
mhm. Nice.
for any nerds who needed Thanksgiving to go to. Our local comic shop provides that service to the nerd community. So I was happy to see that Rose and Hunter and AJ, the whole gang was there, and Rao was there, and it was neat. It was neat to see.
Always cool to see, and I think big thing when we talk about this channel, please support your local comic book shop. We're going to talk about a lot about comics on this channel. Please, if you're gonna buy comics or anything like that, please support your local comic shop. They certainly can always use your help, and they're a great resource for comic book fans. Um, Mike and I, for years, have had very interesting conversations about kind of comic books, and that while we love breaking down plots, while we love breaking down characters and studies on characters, one of the things me and Mike have always had a very kind of shared affinity for is kind of the origins of how these things started. And a debate that's popped up a lot in the last couple of years, and it's been a debate much longer than that. But
It
obviously,
goes way back.
the internet age kind of blows everything up, obviously. And this year, there was a very popular Stan Lee kind of biography that showed on Disney Plus.
I still haven't seen that yet.
It got some traction, and Mike's seen. I think you've lent me DVDs of 3 or 4 Stan Lee biography things that you've seen, but kind of comes into the origin specifically of Marvel Comics, of who is actually responsible for the success of Marvel. In that, while so many, you will only see Stan Lee credited with it. There's a lot of folks who feel like Kirby, the great Jack Kirby, as well as Steve Ditko, deserve more credit, or even maybe more credit than Stan Lee himself. So, Mike, I'll kind of open it with you before I kind of go. If you look at, and I think with one thing we'll set the table on, me and Mike, I don't think there's any shade from either one of us at any of these three gentlemen. I think we can agree that without Kirby, without Lee, without Ditko, we do not have comics or the characters that we have to the extent that we have. All three of these guys were geniuses who did a great job, maybe to different extents. But without these three and the kind of perfect mix that they made, we absolutely do not have, the comics that we have. But with that said, Mike, for you, with everything you've kind of looked at and all that, when you look at Marvel, do you believe it was more of a Lee thing, or do you think it's more of a Kirby Ditko kind of creation?
Well, I will say for years, I was firmly on the Stan Lee train, and I didn't realize how much because he's a writer,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm passionate about writers. That's where all the good ideas come from. Somebody writes a book, it gets turned into a movie, Hollywood ruins it, whatever. Um, but I don't think I fully understood until recently, like how collaborative the effort was. And there are, and you'll see this on YouTube a lot. Plus, there, if you dig into the world of the fanzines from the 70s and the 80s, there are those diehard Kirby fans that say, no, Kirby created everything.
Yep.
Stan Lee had nothing to do with it. I have, after delving into that whole world, and watching countless Stan Lee interviews and the few that are available of Ditko and Kirby, I have come to believe that it truly was more collaborative than they're saying. Although I do think that you know, I think in the aftermath of the creative explosion that happened in the 60s, that Stan Lee drove his narrative, into the ground, that he was, he created everything.
Yeah.
I have seen the forensic, as Arlen Schumer says, the forensic comic book evidence
Yeah.
that does show that a large portion of the plots were Kirby's ideas, and that Stan Lee probably just filled in the dialogue for many of those.
Mhm.
But you have to go back in time to what was going on. I mean, this was a third or fourth rate industry, the bottom of the barrel of the publishing industry. They were cranking out, a comic book or two a week in a factory type environment,
Yeah.
a small room. Drawing boards were often right next to each other, and they were cranking them out as fast as they could. This was a trashy throwaway medium. Nobody expected it to be analyzed or delved into the depth that it has been.
Yeah.
And I believe that, for better or worse, probably for better, Stan Lee took a step forward and became the face of Marvel Comics when it needed a spokesperson. He was there. He had the personality. He had the ability to go out and talk to the public and give very good interviews. Extremely personable guy. The famous story of me
Yeah.
and
No,
Jackson.
obviously one of the
We
most charismatic.
we
Yeah.
got to meet him one time. Jackson and I love Stan Lee. So I have come to the understanding, seeing, looking into both sides of it, that it really was a lot more of a collaborative effort than either side wants to. One side says, I did it all, the other side says, I did it all. But I think the reality is much more closer to they all work together on these amazing creations. Yeah, uh, I do believe that there was a lot of spite for as far as Spider-Man goes. I
Hmm.
do believe that Stan, threw that idea at the wall, and eventually it proverbially stuck to the wall and climbed a little bit, as Spider-Man tends to do.
Yeah.
Um, and I do believe that although Stan Lee may have come up with the concept, that Ditko really drove it home and created it to what, and fleshed it out. I don't think there was time, in that work environment for Stan Lee to really conceptualize all these universes completely, and then just, in the way the Marvel method has been come to,
Yeah.
understood.
Come to find.
Yeah, I
That just seems
really
like Kirby went and drew some panels, and then Stan filled in the bubbles.
I think, and this forensic comic book evidence points to, what Kirby was allowed to do with DC when he went to DC, and how clunky his dialogue was.
Yeah.
Although his ideas were amazing,
Fantastic.
and his universes that he created were incredible, the finesse that Stan Lee added to those stories by, possibly guiding Kirby a little bit this way or that way, and then putting in good dialogue, made all the difference.
Yeah. It's funny because me and you have talked about this a lot, and I think like you, I was 100% not Stanley, and these other guys are, just upset that Stan's getting all the credit. And then you look back at it, and as I've gotten older, one of the things I did a couple years ago, I tracked down a lot of Jack Kirby's DC work, and that I'm a much bigger DC fan than Marvel. I love Marvel. Obviously, I got Marvel stuff all around me, but I grew up more DC, and so I'd always heard about the New Gods and seeing Dark Side and things. So I'm like, man, I haven't really dug deep into those. And I think the interesting thing is you see from a creative standpoint when you read those and stuff like the Forever People, Commandi, Mr. Miracle, Etrigan, that kind of stuff that Kirby did. Um, you see how much creativity Kirby had and how much the designs and the art that he has sell the story. And that what I will say is, while I really do enjoy all those DC comics, the dialogue is pretty clunky. It's a little simplistic, a little very hard to find a lot of depth in terms of, like the storytelling of it. However, the art does such a great job of selling everything you need it to.
I know that was the beauty of Kirby. Like he could take a crummy story and just make it look so good you had to read it.
Yeah, and I think for me, I've actually kind of come around to where I would almost say I give Kirby more credit than Lee. Now, I don't take shots at Stanley at all. I think Stanley, like you said, I think he necessarily stepped forward and became, for lack of a better term, the mascot of Marvel when they desperately kind of needed it. He became the public face, and as charismatic as he is, it's so hard to watch Stan Lee in anything and not just feel like you're talking to like your grandfather or something like that. Like it just he comes off like a beloved loved one, like that favorite uncle at Thanksgiving who stops by. Where you're just like, this guy every time he's here, he has stories to tell.
You love him, right? You
Yeah,
love
and I think I will say that where I've come around to kind of Kirby and Ditko more. The visualization elements, I think, particularly in the comic book medium, while I think a great story is always required, um, art and the ability of art to sell comics is kind of unparalleled. In that, if you want to talk about characters that take off and not, the Spider-Man costume that was designed by Ditko, drawn out and realized by him, is so iconic in his last because it's such a great piece of art. You look at the way Kirby drew Thor and the visualization of Asgard. And it's one of those things where you can describe it to someone, but until someone makes it look real, the way that art does, the way it comes to life on the pages. I think for me, where I've realized, I think art in comic books in particular, I don't know how true this is anymore. For me as a kid, when I was reading comics, what got me interested wasn't the story, it was the art. I think for better or worse, the entry point for a lot of kids into comic books is just what looks cool, right? Like
him.
he's
Yeah,
become my favorite character now because of the story. When I was a
yeah,
kid, there was just something striking about the way Batman looked.
yeah.
That Batman's costume design just looked
His
cool.
gadgets.
Yeah, just the car, the cave, all of it. And
Yeah.
that was the initial thing that got me to where, like, man, I love this character. And then obviously over time you read the stories and you get more of the character arc. But I think in the comic book medium, the realization of what the Hulk looks like and how much that's connected. That's a lot of Kirby. The Ditko's ability to draw characters like Strange and Peter Parker. One thing that's interesting is when I watched this recent Stan Lee one, he talked a lot about how originally he wanted Kirby to draw Peter Parker or Spider-Man, and then he couldn't really get Kirby to draw it the way he wanted, and so Ditko did it. And then Ditko was able to connect. And it's like you kind of do see that that's a collaborative thing then. And then I think part of why Peter Parker took off is because you had Steve Ditko there to draw a character who could look a little more normal and didn't have
Let,
that sort of He-Man look of Captain America and Thor.
let's go back in time to, let's say, 1959, and you're over there. Marvel wasn't on Lexington Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
That was DC was on Lexington. I forget where Marvel was, but they were like a couple blocks over, right? They're right next to each other. So it's 1959. The skinny tie is in and the suits are in. Everyone wears a hat, chomps on a cigar, and
Yeah.
and you're in this, sweatshop in a dying industry. And that's what everybody in the time, of the time describes it. Like comics were fizzling out.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they were on their way out. And superheroes were, you know, uh, Jack Kirby's stock and trade from the 40s. But through that whole desperate era of the 1950s, guys like Ditko and Kirby were cranking out these science fiction kind of horror suspense.
The
Um,
romance comic.
Romance was
Yeah.
really big. romance, anything that sells. So along comes, 1960, I think is the first Fantastic Four, is 61,
Okay.
60,
60, yeah.
61 or 60. Um, so along comes, this idea for superheroes again, which, by the way,
61 for Fantastic Four. Yeah.
you gotta understand where this, Marvel was a second-rate company in a third-rate industry, and
Mm.
a dying industry at that. They had, like, four artists and one writer. I forget who else was drawing for Marvel at the time, but Kirby was one of them. And they were just cranking out these things to get a paycheck, 10, 15, $20 a page. And that's how they made their money. That's how they fed their families. So they were cranking out romance and all this other stuff. And then, the famous golf game between Leibowitz and Martin Goodman, where Leibowitz says, "Yeah, we're selling superheroes again. We've got this great new comic, Justice League of America. We put all the superheroes together." And Goodman comes back to Stan Lee and says, "We need to start doing superheroes again." So these guys are just cranking it out, but they're busy. They're still trying to crank out their uh, Two-Fisted Tail, the Rawhide Kid, these
Yeah.
other westerns that they're doing, and Amazing Adult Fantasy, and these other titles.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, they're going to throw a superhero title in the mix, and or two. And I think it was just a factory environment. Anybody that had a good idea, and you can see some of the pages of Kirby's where he outlines these great stories. But I really think that there was no time, and they were just all working together to get the books out. And none of them had any clue that somebody 50 years ago was going to read one of those comics. Nobody knew.
Yeah, I
Nobody.
don't think they had no idea these were going to turn into these multi.
No, they all knew that, 6 months from now, what came off the press was going to be in the trash.
No, and I think when you see these debates like this, I mean, I think one, there's always the revisionist history of everybody's the hero of their own story, right? So you're going to hear Stanley. Of course, Stanley's going to assert that he's the guy, and of course, Kirby and descendants of Kirby and all them are going to, Ditko. They're going to say it was them. I think the truth is kind of it's sort of like sports, and I think we've seen this debate recently a lot. The New England Patriots were dominant for about 20 years, 6 Super Bowls, and then there was always the debate: is it more Tom Brady or is it more Bill Belichick? Right, and then you didn't really know, and then Brady went and won a Super Bowl without Belichick, and people start. But when you really look at it, it doesn't happen without either one of them, right?
No.
It's the endless debate. Basketball, we see this: is it Michael Jordan or was it Scottie Pippen plus Jordan? And it's one of those things where it's kind of you have to have the right magical elements all at the same time. And
And I think the
yeah,
reality lies somewhere in between, where are there times when there was completely Ditko's story?
yeah, oh,
Probably. With Stanley just, made some spelling corrections. Maybe. Are there times when it was all Jack Kirby? Probably, where Stanley just, filled in the dialogue. But I think more often than not, it was probably, like Stanley said, they would sit down and draw these stories, and I would tell them an idea for a story and they would draw it. Yeah. I also think that Kirby would tell Stan Lee a story and draw it, and Stan Lee would write the dialogue. I think it was, a little bit of both, and you just wouldn't have had the magic without either, any one of those missing.
well, I think one thing I will give Stanley credit. I think Stanley seems to have definitely been the guy who organized who did what. And what I'll say is, like, I think part of why Spider-Man takes off is that Stan noticed, like, hey, Jack Kirby's probably not the artist for this. Even though you would think, here's going to be our flagship character, here's our big guy. He recognized it. We don't want him to look like that. We want him to look more like what Ditko could draw. And it's interesting in that, like, Stan probably doesn't get enough credit for that piece of noticing, like, the easy decision most people would think is just, well, put your best artist on your best book. And instead he kind of realized, like, nah, Ditko probably draws this one a bit better. And I think me and you have seen this a lot in modern comic books where sometimes they'll get a great artist, but they're not a great artist for that character. I think Jim Lee's a classic example. Jim Lee can draw the heck out of Batman and Superman
Yes.
and Wonder Woman. Jim Lee on the Flash doesn't really work because the Flash starts looking like a bodybuilder who took a steroid cocktail. He loses the kind of athletic, wiry body that you associate with the Flash, and then they kind of look all the same, right?
Yeah.
There's other artists that you look at. I think Kirby's an interesting one, in that I think Jack Kirby has a lot of great characters that he can draw, but I think it's one of the first issues of the Forever People. They have Jack Kirby draw Superman, and it just looks off. Like, it's not bad. It's not bad artwork, but I want to say it's the first issue of the Forever People series he has, and Superman shows up in that. And like, it's cool. It's Jack Kirby. It's Superman. Like, this should be, but it doesn't look as good as some of the older, comics, the folks who draw Superman. And it's just, I will give Stan Lee credit for that. I think a lot of that was knowing to put the right people at the right time. And I think it's kind of one
Yeah.
of the things where Stan Lee was probably a little more like the coach of a team. And a lot of it is knowing what to coach and what to say and how to say it and presenting the right front. But you don't get that done without the players. And that's more the Kirby and Ditko piece.
Another thing that comes to mind in those lost years from 49 to 61, how many times did Stan have to make a decision like that? Like, you're going to try this Western character, characters that nobody remembers anymore.
Yeah.
It was probably just the way things ran. Like, I'm going to give this book to Ditko. I'm going to give this one to, Kirby. And, I think that, it was a collaborative effort, but I do have seen the forensic comic book evidence that shows that, a lot of those stories were probably Kirby's, and Kirby had some great ideas. And when Carmine Infantino gave him free reign over in DC, you
Mm-hmm.
could see his grandiose ideas. And can
Well,
you?
the world building and the new guy
Yes,
and
I
Mr.
mean,
Miracle
they're incredible. See,
especially is very
there's
impressive.
no doubt in my mind that half the time, the ideas for the stories were Kirby's, and half the time when Kirby was stuck, behind finishing panels for, Fantastic Four, where Stan Lee had to step in and say, okay, for next month for, Thor, we're going to try this idea, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and I think they just, it was production art, you had to crank it out. And what an amazing group of talent, to do that in such a, forgettable throwaway medium at the time.
Yeah.
It took a while for the rest of the world to catch up to how amazing those characters were and what stories were created and what stories could be created with those characters. It took a while for
Yeah.
pop culture to really catch up. But at the time, it was just a throwaway medium. I mean, look at the Hulk behind you. He's gray. Like they
Yeah.
messed up on the
Now it's like
coloring.
a printer in coloring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And Stan, and Martin Goodman said, no, he's supposed to be green like Frankenstein. And like nobody knew Frankenstein was green because he was black and white, you
Yeah.
know, and but the most popular, I heard this recently, the most popular model kit of the time were the Universal monster movies,
Mm-hmm.
and they were colored, plastic, and Frankenstein was green, and it was selling really well. And Martin Goodman said, "Well, we need a green character, but it can't be Frankenstein because he's copywritten."
So
So
goes the
okay,
whole.
so
Now, some of these
it's just
origins,
one of those things. Like things were fast and loose. Nobody was
yeah,
going to remember. No one was going to do forensic comic book evidence.
it kind
Nobody
of
was going to do
reminds
that.
me at work. Sometimes you'll work on a project and no one's really owning it, and then it works, and you get a deadline, and then everybody's
Oh,
just contributing
you know,
everything to it. No one's really. And then if it works, then all of a sudden everybody was the genius. Oh, well, I was actually
It
the one
was
who.
my idea. It was my idea.
It kind of seems
Yeah,
like these things, had they not become famous, we probably wouldn't be having who was more responsible. For
what what I kind of want to do is, make sure that Stan gets his credit.
oh, for
Um, and of course Kirby gets his. The thing about it is that Kirby was, he was so discounted, for the first part of his career, that you want to give him more credit, just because he was such a genius, and there'll never be another one like him. And so you want to make sure he gets his due. And for the last 10 or 15 years or more, it's been there's been more of an emphasis put on the work that he did in
yeah,
Marvel in those years. And you're absolutely right. You couldn't have one without the other, and have come up with that universe. And lightning struck, at the right time, and they just really caught on. And it was amazing. And they were all seasoned pros. You
yeah,
know, at that point, they'd been doing comics for 20 plus years. They were veterans. They knew how to create. They knew how to crank out the material, but they were just really, really good at it. Like Ditko and Kirby were masters of their craft and geniuses, and so was Stan Lee at that point. He had published enough comic books to know what was going to sell, what was going to, what wasn't, how to craft a correct, a good selling comic book story. He knew how to do all that. And without, either one of those pieces, you wouldn't have the Marvel universe. So I kind of, I've kind of come to the conclusion that they probably all had a decent hand in it, but Stan was just the more personable one who took the limelight.
well, and I think there's a huge piece to that. In that, one of the things is that I've had at times, work. One of the things that I have had in my life where I've gotten credit is typically in work scenarios. I've been the guy who has to give the presentation, and
Yeah,
you do sometimes get in arguments at work, and I've had people come in where like, well, I can do this, but I can't present, so I need you to present it. And then when it's done, the person's like, well, we didn't really have anything to do with it. It's like, okay, it's one thing for you to have the idea, but you
yeah,
also need the person to present this and make people buy into it.
yeah,
I think it's the same thing that we see in a lot of movies and things, and that like we've recently talked a little bit about James Bond in this movie. You can conceptualize the James Bond films all that you want. If Sean Connery's not there to give that the public face that people look at and go, no, I want to be like that guy, you can conceptualize everything. It doesn't matter if you don't have someone people want to see. And I think
yeah,
that's what stands the brilliant face of that. And ultimately, where I get a little tired sometimes is I hear people now where they're like, oh, well, Stan just took all the credit. Yeah, Stan may have taken some more credit than he had, but we don't know Marvel without Stan Lee. Stan Lee being the public face who went out, I'm going to promote these things. I'm going to be, like we said, the lovable kind of relative feel where he kind of walks in and feels like everybody's uncle. That gave Marvel a personality. It gave Marvel something where you're like, Stan soapbox, right? All those stuffs in the back of the books. It gave Marvel a feel. And without that, I don't think we have any of what we've got. So let us know what you think below. If you have not read some of these, I have a recommendation that I would get once a month. Marvel puts one of these, and it's called Marvel Mighty Masterworks. Now, Marvel Masterworks has been around forever, but some of those have gotten expensive. They're hardcover. These ones are brilliant. They come out once a month. It collects about 10 issues of each. It's the foundations of Marvel Comics. It's a little bit smaller than your standard comic size. It's about $16. If you get the comic book store, if you go to your local comic store, you'll get a classic cover like this that captures one of the actual ones. So I've got a couple here: Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Doctor Strange. You get about 10 to 12 issues in each one. It's $16 for all that. So you're getting about 400 pages of comics most of the time, 300 to 400 pages of comics. Classic stuff. Do yourself a favor, revisit some of these stories. Go to your local comic shop. They'll most likely have these in stock. You get the classic cover. If you order it from one of the mass market publishers, they'll give you kind of a stock cover drawn by a modern artist, which isn't as good. I think there's 20 something volumes of this out, but there's 3 or 4 volumes of Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Thor's had a couple volumes. They've even done some smaller characters like Namor, the original Captain Marvel, and Black Panther. It's great stuff. They're great to read. They're great to share with your kids. I would definitely recommend if you got any Marvel comics that you're interested in to kind of stop by and pick them up. They're the best investment I make every month in comics. It's great to read and revisit them.
Interesting trivia about that Amazing Fantasy.
Mhm.
The cover, from what I understand, Kirby did that cover, but Ditko did the interiors.
Yeah, because they do have in the back, and there's other cool stuff that does come with these. It does have some stuff in the back, a little bit of extras, and they kind of have in here. They actually have the unused #1 cover that
Oh
you
man.
have. So a lot of really cool stuff that you can get from those, but it's a great investment. Read them for yourself. Best thing I love about these, Mike and I always talk about this all the time, getting the kids back involved in comics. Like we love that comics can tell some stories. These are so cool, and that I know I can buy these. I love reading them, but I can also hand it to my young children. They can read these, they get swept into the world of superheroes, and I don't have to worry about there being gore and all kinds of stuff in it that's not appropriate. So
Right,
great stuff.
right.
Really love that Marvel does that every month. I would definitely encourage you to check those out if you can find them. But thanks as always for joining us. Let us know what you think below. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe it. And thank you as always. You have a happy holidays.